Hello, Lyssa deHart here. And today in my ACC to MCC video series, the conversation is really going to center around the concept and ideas of transparency. Transparency is an interesting thing. The definition for transparency for a person is really you invite trust by revealing that you have nothing to hide. You establish yourself as honest and credible person in the eyes of others. And it requires you to be open and vulnerable. And I really like this definition because I think it really sums up, it's not just a sense of opaqueness that we can see through. It is this open, vulnerable willingness to be in the state of I don't know. And this is a big part of how transparency shows up in coaching. And so we're going to take a little dive into this. I think some of the places where it is incredibly useful to be curious about where transparency can show up is where things show up that we might need to name out loud. And this may be something where we've had this internal hit that's shown up and we are like, all of a sudden we're noticing our stomach is kind of knotted, or we're feeling like a real heaviness. Maybe our a weight is on our shoulders. Maybe our heart is really feeling heavy or tight. And so these internal hits that we might be having are something that the client doesn't know we're experiencing this. And so transparency shows up as a way that we are sharing our own experience of what the client is sharing. An example of this is I had a client talking about a really heavy subject. It was a very painful situation that they had been in. And as they were talking, I noticed I was feeling this heaviness in my heart. Like I just felt like just really heavy in my heart. And so I named that to the client, as you're telling me this story, I'm noticing there's a great weight on my own heart as you're telling me this story. And I'm wondering how this shows up for you. And this really leads into the next place to be curious around transparency, which is really checking our assumptions. I know my heart is feeling heavy. I don't know that the client's heart is feeling heavy. So I want to offer the observation transparently. They now know what experience I'm having, but it's theirs now to do with what they will. And so that's really important. And then the third, and there's many more than three, but another place to really be aware is a consciousness around our biases. Whether it's a positive bias or a negative bias, being really aware of that so that we maybe need to name that. There have been times in coaching where I have said to a client, wow, this is really triggering a bias for me. I have a bias around this. So if for some reason I seem like I'm telling you something that doesn't resonate, or I'm saying something or asking something that doesn't resonate, please know this may be mine. So call me out on it. And the client will be like, okay, I sure will. And again, that's a level of transparency where we're just naming, like, I have a bias here. Or, and the way that I see it happen in early coaching is we have the bias, and what we do with it is instead of naming it, we take action on it. And so this becomes where transparency in coaching can be incredibly powerful as a tool to really communicate more deeply with a client, to listen more deeply, to really partner more deeply. But it can also cause other issues if what we do is we don't recognize when we have a bias and we just share the bias. And we think we're being transparent because we're telling them something we believe, but we are maybe becoming judgmental in that moment. We're assuming that the way that we would do something, or the way that we would feel about something, or the way that we would experience something is the way that the client might feel, think, or experience the same thing. And often that is not the case. Occasionally you will be accurate, but even if you're right, it is always the benefit of the client. It is to the benefit of the client if we offer it as an open, here, does this make any sense to you? This is what I noticed coming up for me. And I think also around transparency, the other place where we can get into trouble is if I have a client that I'm working with, let's say they're having, I don't know, an issue with a parent or a child, and I'm having an issue with a parent or a child that is very similar to the issue that my client is having. I have to be very clear with myself that I may be oversharing too much about my own personal experience and how I'm handling that, thinking I'm being transparent, but what I'm really doing is I'm bringing my stuff into the coaching conversation, and it's not clean at that point. And there is work that maybe I need to be doing with my own coach or with my own kid or parent, but there is not a space in coaching for me to bring my issues into the same space that the client is bringing their issues, just because my issues got activated by what they're talking about. And that happens often in coaching, is our clients will bring to us the same sort of issues that we ourselves are working on, or we may only be one step ahead of them on the journey. And I think it's really important to never assume that just because we're maybe one step ahead of them on the journey, that they're going on the same journey that we are. We may be going in very different directions and have very different needs that need to be met in order for us to be able to explore this. So as the coach, what I do to get where I need to go and what my client does to get where they need to go may be very, very different, maybe worlds apart. And so again, allowing ourselves to use our self-awareness, like, this is really triggering pain for me as I hear you talking about this. I don't need to share what my story is, but I can say to the client, I'm noticing, or I'm experiencing as you speak, that, I've got like some anger coming up, and I'm not really sure where that's coming from for me. Well, I would know where it was coming from for me, but I'm noticing some anger coming up, and I'm wondering if that has any relevance to what you're talking about for you. Or I'm noticing my heart is heavy, like I mentioned before, with the really, the heavy, painful story led to me having a heavy, painful heart. I wasn't attached to it. And the client was, in a client has a choice then to say, no, that doesn't really work for me. That's not what I'm experiencing at all. Or it might actually sort of open the door for them to be able to explore into a place that they haven't yet been able to go to. And by listening at that kind of level, what we do is we share with clients that we are capable of being in that space with them. And so when we're looking at the arc from ACC to MCC, younger or newer coaches may hear something painful, and what you may find yourself wanting to do, because many of us come into this profession of coaching because we want to help people and we care about people, and we want people to feel better and get to their dreams and be all sorts of wonderful things. And so it is a really easy hook to hear something painful from a client and move into sort of a parallel process with them and then want to save them. Like, I wished I had been saved, so I'm going to try and save you. And so we move into a saving or helping, or we move into trying to make it okay, or have it, move them away from the painful experience by like, well, have you ever had a time where, you didn't feel that way, and we try and get out of it, or we try and help them through it by telling them, what they might consider doing. I think another way that it shows up early in coaching is that we avoid it. Like, I'm not even going to go there. That's too much like therapy. I'm going to just ignore it completely. And so what we do is we step over it. And so the client shares this thing about how they're feeling. And as a result of that, we go, I'm not comfortable with that. So what would you like to get by the end of the conversation? And so what ends up happening is the client is left with, they shared this thing, and now we've moved on. It hasn't necessarily hurt their feelings or anything like that, but we've at a very at a very core level said, we can't really hold that kind of space for you. And that's fine if we can't, but we need to be aware of that. But as we're moving towards MCC, we're also expanding our capacity to sit in those uncomfortable places with people, which means we may be needing to do our own work, whether it's through our own coach or maybe coaching supervision. I think the other thing is, and it was sort of interesting, I had a mentor coaching call the other day, and if you've listened to me at all before this, you know how much I adore using metaphors. And with metaphors, we often need to tune our ears. And in this mentor coaching session, there was a pretty powerful metaphor that showed up, but the coach didn't hear it. She heard other metaphors, but she didn't hear that one. And her awareness that she brought into the mentor coaching was, you know, it's interesting. Now that you point that metaphor out, I can hear it. But before that, it's not a metaphor I use, so I could not hear it. And now I'll be on the lookout for the metaphors that I don't typically use myself, because that was a moment of awareness. And I think that's another example of that movement from ACC towards MCC, is that we're really starting to tune our ears to listen out past what is comfortable and normal for us. And we're tuning our ears for what the deeper, more meaningful issues are that may show up in the space. So again, you know, as you're moving towards MCC, you're going to be paying attention below the surface and really allowing yourself the space of curiosity and being in a place of not knowing and openness. And that may show up if we've set an agreement, but maybe the agreement is shifting through the coaching conversation. We may need to stop and be transparent about the fact, I'm feeling a little lost here right now. Like, this may be connected in your mind, but I'm not understanding the connection. And I'm curious how, and you don't need to explain that necessarily to me unless it's useful, but I'm very curious about how this connects to where you said you wanted to go by the end of the conversation. And for clients, there's times where they have very disparate thoughts that are kind of out there. And when you ask a question like that, they're like, oh yeah, it fits together like this. Or they're like, oh yeah, I'm actually taking us down a different trail because I need to go down that trail, or because I'm avoiding this trail. And it's a place of self-awareness again. The other things that I'm going to be really paying attention to, beyond just asking if I find myself lost and being transparent about that, I'm going to also be noticing patterns. I was working with a client who as she was telling me about anything that was uncomfortable, she would start to do this thing. And alas, for a while, I never asked her about it. I just sort of noticed that was a thing that she did. But at one point in the coaching, I think it was on my coaching journey. So I was probably, I think it was a PCC. I was really starting my PCC when this started. And I finally, as I was working towards my MCC, I was like, wait a minute, something's going on here, and I'm like stepping over it. I'm just ignoring it, honestly. And so I didn't know what it meant. And I had kind of thought maybe she just has a tickle in her throat, but then there was a pattern to how it showed up. And when I finally asked, like, I'm noticing this pattern of when it seems to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, but when we get to a topic that is delicate or painful or uncomfortable, you start doing a little cough. Is there, like, what are you noticing as you hear me say that? And she was able to say, you know, I can just really feel how my throat is tightening up as I'm talking about this. And so then it became a shift into, what about your throat tightening up might be useful for us to explore, that would allow you to have more of a voice in this situation that you find yourself. And it changed really the depth of the coaching completely by just asking what was happening in the space that I had just been ignoring because I wasn't tuning my ears to listen to it. And so it was an opportunity for me, and it really stuck with me clearly. I also really listen to powerful big words, always, never. I recently was listening to a call, and like, the client so regularly said, you know, it's just play. It's just relaxation. It's just self-care. And she wasn't even aware of it. And she wasn't saying it in a kind of snarky way, like I might have been just saying it. It was really like, it was just, it's just self-care. It's just playfulness. It's like, it's just this, it's just that. And that's such a qualifier that because she had said it so often, I might have asked, I'm noticing this qualifier of it's just this and it's just that. And I'm wondering what the just represents for you, or what the just is stopping you from doing and allowing yourself. Because she was using it really in this particular conversation as a way to diminish the value of something that was really important to her. And so that was a really interesting place to be curious. And again, that's transparency. You're noticing something and you're naming it out loud versus noticing it, keeping it tucked inside of yourself, and then pressing on thinking that you know what the client is talking about, or that you know where the client needs to go. I think the thing comes up with powerful beliefs also. We often have these stories that run very deeply through our lives, and they are very long-term stories about loyalty, about our values. And these powerful beliefs show up in coaching conversations, and often coaches are like, wow, that was really insightful. But they don't really ask, or they may go, wow, that's like, you have strong feelings about that. But they don't ask, like, tell me more about this powerful belief that just showed up. And we might not call it that, but I just heard you say XYZ, and it makes me really curious how that belief or that story is impacting the outcome that you say that you want. How is it bringing you closer to other people, or closer to your dreams, or confidence, or leadership, or executive presence, or whatever? How is it working in your favor? And often when they hear the powerful beliefs spoken back to them, asked in a way where we're asking them how that relates to what they say is important, it gives them an opportunity to explore at a much deeper level some of the things that are below the waterline that are driving their behaviors, their behaviors and actions, and ultimately leading to their results. And I think that listening, as you're going towards your MCC, as you're moving, in this trajectory or this arc from ACC to MCC, we've really need to practice our listening and fine tuning it in a manner that we let go of this need for the right question. Like there's a perfect question out there. I don't believe that there's a perfect question. I think there's a scale of usefulness, and I mentioned this before. And so it's letting go of this idea of the right question, but rather to be capable of letting our own stuff go so that we're showing up fully. And an example of this would be, maybe a client brings to you a kind of a surface level topic, and the client says, what would you like to work on today? And the client says, I'd like to work on my motivation. I haven't been very motivated. And the coach may go, oh, I know what motivation means. Okay, so then where would you like to be by the end of the conversation? Bypassing, getting more clarity and awareness, and being transparent. Like, I don't know what you mean by motivation. I don't know what motivation feels like when you have it, or how you notice you don't have it. Like, what's missing when you don't have motivation? What are the things that lead to not having motivation? Because what will happen is we start to explore and clarify what this word, this powerful word, means. Is what we're going to end up doing is getting a much more clarity around the agreement that we're setting about what's important for us to be exploring in this conversation. And then we can ask where, they'd like to be by the end of it, but then we can start walking down whatever road they bring forward, or whatever thread they bring forward that supports their curiosity about their motivation. I think also, there is the competencies that I see being met when we are practicing transparency with our client really comes out of agreement setting, a lot more inquiry into what is important and meaningful, a lot less assumptions. I think that's super important. I think it really hits the competency of trust and safety, where we're, really acknowledging and supporting our clients to fully express what they are feeling, their perceptions, concerns, these beliefs, these powerful beliefs, that are showing up. I think it's also a way that we're partnering with our clients by inviting them to respond to whatever we offer, but accept wherever they want to take it, or if they like it or don't like it, or find it useful or don't find it useful, we're letting go of that, but we're throwing it into the space when it shows up because we're trusting that it showed up for us. It might be relevant for the client, and if not, no harm, no foul. We'll just move along to the next thing that's important, right? And then maintaining presence, where the coach is really in this state of curiosity to learn more about the client, not tell the client what the coach knows, but rather to really learn more about the client, their experiences, their perceptions, the who of them, right? Not just the what of the situation, but the who they are at a very deep level, so that from this deeper awareness, they're able to come to actions and ideas about how they want to move forward, which really lends itself to the final competency that I think it really shows up, transparency really shows up in, which is evoking awareness, which is this whole middle section of a coaching conversation where you as the coach allow yourself with no attachment to share observations. Not necessarily observations about the coachee or the client. I mean, it may be there, like I'm noticing a pattern of things, but it also might be your own noticing, like I'm noticing my heart is feeling heavy, or I'm noticing that I've got like this kind of buzzing in my head, and I'm curious, it feels like this is a very heady conversation. I'm wondering how you're experiencing yourself. Our intuitions, or sharing comments, thoughts, or feelings that are showing up for us, but we're doing it in a way where we're still making that observation and then turning it over to the client with a question. Here's the observation. Here's the question. What are you noticing? How does that land on you? As you hear me saying that, does anything new show up for you? Or does anything that you've set aside show up for you? And then the exploration through a verbal or tonal or body language. I love to tell this story. I have a client who's very facially expressive. And I mean, I have no idea what those facial expressions mean sometimes. And I will regularly say, that face, what is this face meaning? Because I don't know. And that's the vulnerability piece. I'm asking a question. The client could come back and say, it means I think that was the stupidest question you've ever asked. But often they're coming back with like, I never thought of it that way. Like I just had this big insight or a big epiphany from the conversation. And so that's the way that what we're doing, transparently sharing of our own experience and being fully shown up in the space, but also listening with a very fine-tuned ear to what the client is bringing forward, we create a deeper partnership. And that really is, again, the journey from ACC to MCC around trust and safety, around partnership, and around transparency. I hope you found this useful. I appreciate that you watched the video. I'll have more videos coming in the new year. And I'm also started the Coaching Studio podcast where I'm interviewing amazing coaches. If you have an iPad or any mobile device that you listen to podcasts on, I'm on pretty much all the podcast series at this point, where you can find me on any app. We're also doing the podcast on YouTube, so you should be able to find it there also on my channel. Thank you so much for being here today, and I wish you well.